Okay, guys, so what we're looking at is why was there a crisis in Czechoslovakia as opposed to anywhere else? So far, we have looked at a crisis in Berlin, and it makes sense for Berlin to be the center of the crisis. It makes sense for Berlin to be the center of disputes between the superpowers. It is a crossing point between the Eastern Bloc and the West. We've also looked at Cuba. Cuba, 80 miles off the coast of the United States, a state that previously had firmly been in the sphere of influence of the United States, being a socialist state, and ultimately ending up being an ally of the Soviet Union. And we've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that's unfolded. It makes sense for those two places to be at the heart of the Cold War. So why are we now moving to Czechoslovakia? Now, in order to understand Czechoslovakia, it's important, I feel, to take a step back to what we've previously had a look at back in Hungary. Now, we studied the Hungarian uprising, and I'm not going to review that now. But the fundamental conditions in which the Hungarian uprising occurred bears a lot of similarity to what happens in Czechoslovakia. We've got the circumstances of a new Soviet leader seeking to show that they are different. Nikita Khrushchev, partly due to the suggestion that he had thrown away an advantage in Cuba, Khrushchev is replaced as leader of the Soviet Union by a guy called Leonid Brezhnev. So whereas with the Hungarian uprising, we have a new Soviet leader, Khrushchev, attempting to show that he's different, we've now got another new leader of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, attempting again to show that he's different and that he might not be against the ideas of reform, of change. Now, Imre Nagy, as we know from Hungary, he took the opportunity that he believed to be supported by Khrushchev to bring in significant changes, reforms of the economy, reforms of the freedom of the press, reforms of the freedom of speech, and ultimately, the straw that broke the camel's back, the idea of withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. Now, that was the unacceptable moment as far as Khrushchev was concerned, and led to the Soviets responding with force, invading using their Red Army, which was still occupying much of Eastern Europe, and having Imre Nagy replaced. Nagy was captured, and Nagy was later hung. So it was an action by Soviet troops, ordered by the Soviet Union, and who they saw as responsible, Imre Nagy, was executed. So a satellite state is being brought back into line by force by the Soviet Union. Now that's really important because we're going to see a very similar situation occur in Czechoslovakia, but with subtly different outcomes. Now, before we get to looking at the crisis itself, there's a word that I want us to focus on to get in our minds. Now, it's not a new word because we have come across it before, but I think it's an important one to revisit, particularly in the context of what we're going to see result from the Czechoslovakian crisis. And it's the word doctrine, doctrine as a set of beliefs. Now, remember, we've come across this before when we looked at the Truman Doctrine, this promise that the United States would respond if free countries are targeted by communism. It's therefore led to United States involvement in Greece. Although we haven't covered it in depth, the United States were involved in a war in Korea. And also, before the period that we're looking at, 1968, the United States has been involved in a war in Vietnam. In each of these, it was the case of the communists seeking to take control or expand their control. So it's important to note that at the time of the Czechoslovakian crisis of 1968, the United States has many, many troops, 100,000 troops, in South Vietnam, fighting alongside the South Vietnamese against the invasion by the Chinese-backed Communist North. So the United States is effectively acting along the lines of the Truman Doctrine. And also the other important word that we've used before to describe American policy, containment. Okay. Now, with a doctrine, how does it differ from other ideas? It's not a ceremony. A ceremony is the what is to be done rather than the why. It's not ambiguous. It's very clear. This is what is going to happen if you do what we are telling you not to. And it's also different to a proposition. Proposition comes from proposal. It's a suggestion of something that they believe should be done. A doctrine is saying, if you do X, Y will happen. The response is outlined before the trigger occurs. Now, in this case, as we're going to see, a doctrine previously associated with the Truman Doctrine, with America, we're going to see a doctrine be the outcome of the actions of Czechoslovakia and the Warsaw Pact. So let's have a look at what occurs now before we go any further. Now, much like had occurred with the Hungarian uprising, we've got de-Stalinisation as an impact. Now, we're 15 years on since the death of Stalin. So the expectation would surely be that Stalin's impact and Stalin's control has dissipated. Certainly he himself is not in control anymore. But there's another battle that's going on amongst communists throughout the world. Because so far in our study, we have focused upon the Soviet Union, Russia, the Russian states, and by extension the satellite states being the focus of communist ideas and communist control in the world. But we've maybe done things a disservice here, because there's another major country, important, significant force, who operate a communist belief system. So China is starting to have these disagreements with the Soviet Union. From the initial period of 1949, China and the Soviet Union being close, we see a significant deterioration in their relationship. For example, China, led by a guy called Chairman Mao Zedong, they firmly believe in what Stalin was doing. So when Khrushchev comes out and starts criticizing Stalin and claiming that, the de-Stalinisation project, moving away from Stalin's approach, China don't like this. And we start to see them quite significantly move away from one another for reasons which become clear. For example, there's massive trust issues between the two nations. There had been promises made to China that the Soviet Union would share their nuclear technology and how to make nuclear weapons with China, but they refuse. They don't do it. They fudge the whole issue. So China start to increasingly get the feeling that the Soviet Union actually see them more of a threat than as a friend. And China ends up being quite critical. They come out very critically against Khrushchev and how the Soviet Union had, in their views, kind of wimped out of going ahead with putting pressure on the United States over the Cuban Missile Crisis. So relations between the two are not strong. And China is clearly making the point that the Soviet Union are not effectively sustaining, supporting, maintaining the beliefs of communism. They think that the Soviet Union is basically gone soft. And that's an important background to what we're seeing in 1968. And we will go on in future studies to see how that relationship between China and the Soviet Union actually ends up becoming pivotal in what happens in the 1970s to the whole Cold War relationship. So let's just step back. Before 1968, let's look at 1967. Now, the leader of Czechoslovakia at this time was a guy called Novotny. I'll show you a picture of him. There he is. I think Novotny is quite a looker, but I don't think everybody does. But certainly for me, he looks like he's got that Hollywood idol look. Although there is a little bit about him which reminds me of the farmer from Babe. So I kind of expect him to be on a farm somewhere. Now, Novotny operated very much in the Stalinist mindset. He refused to make reforms to break away from the strict traditional Stalinist control, as Moscow had always made clear they wanted. And as he wouldn't reform, the Czech economy starts to collapse. The Czech economy is in dire position. So those in Czechoslovakia who were fervent communists, I can't stress this enough, who believed strongly in communism, they were concerned that as the economy crumbled, so too might communism. So one of the reformers, a guy called Alexander Dubček, he appealed to Moscow to say, look, you need to intervene here. You need to do something. Otherwise, communism might collapse in Czechoslovakia. And not dissimilar to how Khrushchev responded to Imre Nagy, Leonid Brezhnev responds by agreeing with Dubček, removing Novotny from power and putting Alexander Dubček in charge. Now, Alexander Dubček introduces these reforms which are described as the Prague Spring. Now, reform is to make changes for improvement in order to remove abuse and injustices. And Alexander Dubček, I'll just show you a picture of Dubček. There he is. You can see that his rise to power is greeted with massive excitement. He's kind of the poster boy for reform. People look at Dubček and see him as representing the future. And he actually coins an idea of socialism with a human face. The idea of staying committed to communism, to socialism, but making changes to make it a better quality of life for ordinary people. So the kind of reforms that he brings in aren't dissimilar to those reforms that we saw Imre Nagy bring in. Reforms to freedom of speech. Up to this point, you weren't allowed to criticise the government. You certainly weren't allowed to criticise the Soviet Union or other members of the Warsaw Pact. The secret police, a police force that operates in secrecy against people acting against the state. So people who were disapproved of by the state would be removed overnight, perhaps. This kind of activity, Dubček wanted an end to this secrecy. Dubček wants to bring transparency. So he wants people to be allowed to say what they think. He wants people to have a voice. And he wants an end to this climate of fear of the secret police, removing people based upon their points of view. He wants to have reform to trade unions, to give trade unions a greater voice where they disagree with the treatment of workers, where they feel that the expectations put upon workers are unreasonable. He brings in the idea that people will be allowed to challenge that through trade unions, groups of workers, having that dialogue, that chat, that exchange of views with the government with a view to making changes. He also wants to bring in reforms to end travel restrictions, to enable freer movement. Now, although ultimately he might like the idea of people being able to move and have experience of visiting the West, Dubček, and it's important to state, he doesn't go so far as to say he is going to do that. So it isn't a Berlin Mark II situation where fear's over the brain drain. But the idea is just to loosen the control that had been imposed by Novotny and give people more freedom. And as you can see, if you look at that picture, look how positive he is. Look how happy the people around him seem to be. There's a real feeling here of a new dawn. Similar in some ways to what we might look upon as to how people reacted in Britain in 1997 when Tony Blair became Prime Minister and there was a Labour government after 13 years of Conservative government. Or you may have seen the pictures of the ecstatic response to Barack Obama becoming President of the United States. Maybe even, although less visual because of the restrictions in place, but the feeling of relief and excitement at Joe Biden replacing President Trump. There's a sense that now Dubček's here, things are going to be better for us. And this period in which people feel this way and in which these reforms start to be enacted is known as the Prague Spring. Now, the reasons for that are partly seasonal, because the spring is really when he comes in. We're talking, when the reforms start to hit home is March, April, May of 1968. So there is this idea that it is springing a new season of change and possibility. It can also fit into the idea of a spring from a mountainside stream, that clear water, which might, if you're exhausted, if you're tired, there's a spring, water gives life, water revives people. Even the idea of a spring in your step. Sometimes that's a description of people who are feeling a bit better. Great to see you back with a spring in your step. I'm sure you'll see many teachers like that when you return back to school and the enjoyment of actually seeing you rather than delivering things through the remote system that we have been doing. So it's a really positive idea, but it's not going to last. Because one of the concerns, as I said earlier, Dubček doesn't announce and start having freedom of movement to the West, but we start to see suggestions that might change. There's closer relations with West Germany. And there's even, as a result of the freedom of expression, we start to see anti-communist protests appearing in Czechoslovakia. Even anti-communist, pro-capitalist, pro-democratic protests, which are arguing that Czechoslovakia should start to consider a future outside of the control of the Soviet Union. Now, the mechanism of that control, you might remember, certainly militarily, is the Warsaw Pact. That was the counter to NATO that was founded in response to West Germany joining NATO. You get the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact is really controlled by Moscow. And not only is Leonid Brezhnev concerned about what's happening in Czechoslovakia, particularly the idea that Dubček potentially might remove them from the Warsaw Pact, but there's also a knock-on effect of a concern from other Warsaw Pact leaders. So we have this concern then and fear that from the other Warsaw Pact leaders that what's happening in Czechoslovakia, if it goes unchecked, could happen in their own country. And therefore they would be out of a job, They may even, worse than that, and have a more violent response if this is allowed to continue unchecked. Now, what happens, and I do really, really like this, we end up with this photo. Now, this photo I think is absolutely incredible. It's one of my favourite photos. This is taken by a guy called Joseph Kudelka, a young Moravian-born engineer who'd been taking wistful and gritty photos of Czech life. He was in Prague, the capital, when the soldiers arrived. He took pictures of the swirling turmoil and created a groundbreaking record of the invasion that would change the course of his nation. The most seminal piece includes a man's arm in the foreground, showing on his wristwatch a moment of the Soviet invasion with a deserted street in the distance. It beautifully encapsulates time, loss, and emptiness, and the strangling of a society. I adore this photo. I have been to Prague. I strongly recommend you go there one day. And you'll see this is called Wenceslas Square. At the top there, you can see Wenceslas Square in English. You can see at the top there, that's a natural history museum. It's a main thoroughfare in Prague, and it's usually teeming with people. It's cafes, shops, tourists, all sorts of things are going on. But here it's completely dead because people know that the Soviets are coming. There's a real fear. And at 12 o'clock, that was when the Soviets were believed to be invading Prague. So you've got this total silence. Now, importantly, when the invasion happens, it's difficult. It isn't an easy walkover for the Soviet Union. You can see this picture here. So the people, particularly students, this is remembered as very much a student demonstration, student protest, because the University of Prague was world renowned. And you see that they're on the streets. They're stopping the tanks. They're climbing on the tanks. That flag, which is being held, stood on top of the overturned small sort of camper van you can see there. That is the Czech flag. So there was real resistance, and the Soviet troops put that down through blood. People lost their lives. People died as they refused and they fought against the idea of the Soviets retaking control. But they did retake control. And Alexander Dubček reflected on this with a famous quote years later when he said, "You can crush the flowers, but you can't stop the spring." This idea that even though the soldiers coming in have, through force and fear, retaken control of Czechoslovakia, the damage in essence has been done. Because now people have seized control and they've seen a better life, they ultimately are not going to give in. And there's a wonderful museum in Prague. It's really funny. I know you might not associate that with a museum particularly. It's called the Museum of Communism. And you can tell it's very tongue-in-cheek because you can only access it next to a small mini casino and a McDonald's. But it charts a history of communism in Prague and in Czechoslovakia. And it's really moving. It's really captivating, and a lot of it shows some fantastic humour. So again, if you get to go to Prague, and I'd love to do a school trip to Prague, I would have to say, it would be a great place to go. But foremost, and the man who orders the invasion from the Soviet Union and Warsaw-backed forces is Leonid Brezhnev, or Lenny Eyebrows, as I call him, as you can probably work out why from that picture. And this is significant because what Brezhnev seeks to do is to prevent this from happening again. Because 12 years on from the Hungarian uprising, we've got the same thing happen in Czechoslovakia, and it's embarrassing for him. China, again, very critical, saying, how could you allow this reform to take place? How could you allow showing the weakness of the Russian leadership of communism, and we, China, are the real leaders of proper Stalinist communism. And Brezhnev needs to make clear that this cannot happen again. So he announces that the Soviet Union would suppress any attempt to relax communist control. A man called Husak is brought in to replace Dubček. Dubček himself, resigns, is replaced. But I think quite significantly, unlike what happens to Imre Nagy, Dubček is given another role. He's not assassinated. He's not put on trial and executed. So the Soviet Union aren't responding in the same way, which perhaps we can see as progress. Maybe they were concerned about the international outcry if Dubček is executed. So he gets made ambassador to Turkey, which is not a bad gig, really. So he goes off there, out of sight, out of mind. And he does return later on when the Soviet Union falls. Alexander Dubček, along with a poet and famous anti-communist from Czechoslovakia called Václav Havel, they are instrumental in bringing about the reform and the change that they wanted to see in 1968, but they have to wait until the early 1990s. Now, what the Brezhnev Doctrine ultimately says, and all members of the Warsaw Pact sign up to agree with this, is that the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in places where communism was threatened. So what we find ourselves with by the end of 1968 is both superpowers now have a commitment to acting if their ideology, capitalism, communism, is challenged in any country in which they are not actively themselves involved. So it really sets the scene for potentially significant future clashes between the two. But when I say future clashes, it's quite important to note that other than strong condemnation, the United States doesn't do anything about the invasion of Czechoslovakia. They don't mobilize the troops that they've got in West Germany to go and protect the people of Czechoslovakia. They simply condemn it and say that they disagree with what's happened. The reasons behind that lack of stronger action we'll come on to look at in the future when we consider how relations between the Soviet Union and the United States enter a new period